Welcome, and thank you for tuning in. You're listening to the Beyond 50 radio program. I'm Daniel Davis. As we approach 4th of July, our nation celebrates its independence. But it's interesting that you go out, you talk to people about what this really is, you're going to get a varied amount of answers that a lot of people really just maybe don't totally understand what it is that we celebrate. Is it independence? Is it the signing of the Constitution? And in fact, what part of our American rights do we still have? Joining us back here on the program today is a guest, Michael Badnarik. His book is The Good King. We're going to be talking about the foundation of our constitutional freedoms and what exactly it means to be living in America with these particular freedoms. Michael, thank you for joining us back here on the program today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Now, this is always so much fun. I know from the last time we talked, I started going out and talking to people about different things, and it's really amazing just how little we really know about this piece of American history.
Yeah, it's one of the reasons that I started teaching my Constitution class, because people continue to insist that the Department of Education or Social Security was in the Constitution, and clearly not. And it's this, widespread ignorance of, our government and our Constitution that allows the problems to exist.
Now, let's go ahead and talk about the history of the 4th of July. And, tell us why this is an important time for you.
Well, to me, it is to celebrate our independence. I have, all my life, I've been, I like to make my own decisions. My mother said my first word was down. I didn't want her to hold me. I wanted to be on the ground, walking around, learning about the world on my own. And I think that most people, like to make their own decisions. They don't like other people telling them what to do. And so for me, people say, well, happy 4th of July. Well, it's not the 4th of July that's important to me. I can pick any day of any month. But what is important is the independence that we celebrate after our separation from King George. We were suffering through all these taxes, just egregious laws that were being applied to us. And we went through a process. We threw tea in the harbor. We were, resisting. And finally, we got a bunch of guys together in Philadelphia who said enough is enough, and we are going to separate from England. We are going to declare ourselves free, sovereign, and independent state.
Now, it's really interesting when you take a look at what's going on around all of this here. Let's talk about the beginning of the American Revolution as so-called the Declaration of Independence marks.
Well, the Declaration of Independence is certainly an important document, but the American Revolution actually started before that. Benjamin Franklin tried to maintain a difference between revolution and rebellion. Revolution is an astronomical term. When the Earth revolves around the sun, it comes back to its original starting point. And, humans started out as hunters and gatherers, and they had private property. But somehow, we got off onto a tangent where we had the divine right of kings, where the king or the emperor owned everything, and we were just here by, privilege, whatever the king allowed us to do. According to Benjamin Franklin, the American Revolution is a change in the way that people think. Between 1760 and 1775, we started to be less and less enthralled with having a king or emperor tell us what to do. And so he says that was our revolution. And then once we made that decision, the change in thinking had to be backed up by, in this case, a bloody rebellion to enforce the new ideas that we had adopted.
Now, we also hear a lot of interesting history here, and, for instance, the shot heard round the world that Lexington and Concord are famous for. Tell us more about what was going on there.
Well, I like to ask people, what was that shot heard round the world? And I I pretend that we had like a 12-foot diameter cannon and 600 pounds of gunpowder, and when they lit it off, the people in China went, "Oh my God, did you hear that? What was that sound?" Well, clearly that's not plausible. And so I asked them, what was the shot heard around the world? And it was really an idea. The idea prior to that is the king owned everything. He owned all of the 13 colonies, even though he had never been here. And the idea prior to the Declaration of Independence was that only royalty could own property. The shot that was heard around the world was the novel idea that ordinary people could own their own property. You know, they say that, nothing can stop an idea whose time has come. And back in 1775, that was the idea that, well, wait a minute. You know, I have a right to own this farm. I have a right to own my livestock. And that idea that people are able to own their own property and have basically the same rights that a king would have, that is the shot heard around the world that was shared in the constitutions of many of the countries around the world since then.
Now, talking about ownership of properties, I was reading in your book, Good to Be King. I started becoming alarmed about some things you were talking about here, especially when you talk about what it means, what citizenship means. And when I'm looking at this, I'm thinking, okay, well, this is pretty interesting, how much of our freedoms we've surrendered innocently, okay? So, for instance, as you were talking about in that section of your book about citizenship, that the person that creates something tends to be, or, the thing, the entity, is the one that tends to have dominance or reign over that. So, for instance, in the Constitution we hear, we the people, okay? So we the people created the Congress of the United States, so that would mean that we would have dominion over the Congress. Well, then the Congress turned around and they created the United States citizen, or citizen of the United States. Now, as you're reading this, you're realizing, okay, now once that happens and Congress becomes empowered to have dominion over you, the person, okay? Let's go ahead and talk about that a little bit as you were talking about owning property, because it's interesting how you start surrendering your freedoms or your property in ways just based on these two terminologies and the definitions of them.
I think that most of your listeners today would be openly opposed to slavery. American history is fraught with, embarrassments. We, devastated the Indians. We had blacks as slaves. The Constitution actually says that Congress is not allowed to eliminate slavery until after 1809. And, it's written there in the document. It's really, kind of embarrassing to what we understand now. But the whole premise of slavery is that you are not a human person. You're property. We own you. Now, today, I think most people understand why that's, unreasonable. And so in my Constitution class, one of the questions that I ask my students is like, who owns your body? And they look at me perplexed because, it's like, are you kidding? That's a real simple answer. Of course I own my body. And I said, well, okay, if you own your body, shouldn't you be the one to decide what food you eat? You should be the one to decide what liquids you drink. And yet we have the Food and Drug Administration putting GMO products in our supermarket. They put fluoride in our water against our will. And the 18th Amendment, I think, is the most egregious example. The 18th Amendment presumes to create prohibition. So Congress passes an amendment to the Constitution that tells American adults that they're not able to drink alcohol. I said, we go out after class and we go out for a couple beers, are you going to call your mother and ask for permission to drink alcohol? Well, no, of course not. So you're going to ask Congress for permission to drink alcohol. Well, that's ludicrous, too. Where did Congress ever get the authority to give us permission to do that? And the result is that when we look at this, the 18th Amendment in and of itself was unconstitutional because Congress never had the authority to tell American adults what they could or could not drink. And so, we have laws in many of the states, especially in California now, where they have mandatory vaccinations. Well, if the government is telling you that you have to have a vaccination and that you have no say-so in the matter, it doesn't sound like you own your body. It sounds like the government is taking ownership of your body, and they are planning to vaccinate you and give you whatever drugs they want, whether you like it or not. And that's exactly the way we treat cattle in a cattle ring. We line them up twice a year. We have a roundup, and we vaccinate our cattle because we want them to be, healthy. But they have no say-so, and so the government is treating us like cattle. And when people start to realize how much control the government is taking over their own body, then all of those things that you thought you were taught in school don't make sense anymore.
And that's so true, too. And I realized as I was reading that, for instance, you go and you fill out a job application, and you see there, are you a citizen of the United States? There you surrendered your right.
Well, but most people don't know that they have surrendered their right. Mm-hmm. Most people think that I'm a good, law-abiding citizen. I love the red, white, and blue. This is my country. We are the good guys. Of course I'm a citizen of the United States. Well, if we the people created Congress, we have more power than Congress. And a little bit of study about the 14th Amendment. The 14th Amendment was created by Congress, and anybody who is a citizen of the United States is subject to their jurisdiction. It says so in the very first clause. So why would you give up all of your rights in exchange for presumable government privileges? And so one of the most important concepts in my class is the difference between rights and privileges. It's so important that Chapter 2 of my book is available for free download from my website. My website is constitutionpreservation.org, and the menu item is Good to Be King, and you can go there and download Chapter 2 of that book.
Now, as we talk about private property, Lexington and Concord had something to do with that, and it's kind of misunderstood that the British soldiers were there to confiscate guns and ammunition.
Whenever I ask people about Lexington and Concord, first of all, I'm usually surprised that they know anything, but most people will tell me that the primary reason for the British soldiers to be there would be to collect the guns and ammo. And in actuality, that was only their second priority. As long as you're there, you may as well collect the guns and ammo too. But what people don't know, because they really haven't studied the history, is that anytime you're trying to control the mob, mob usually has a couple people who are the leaders of the mob, and they're the ones with all the guts. They're the ones that are, inciting people to say things about, the government control. And those people for us were Samuel Adams and John Hancock. Samuel Adams was the rabble-rouser. He was, able to make the people upset with their situation. And John Hancock was the Bill Gates of his day. He had lots and lots of money, and he could kind of finance a lot of this stuff. And so the two of them formed a team. Well, the British soldiers were looking for Adams and Hancock because, well, they wanted to arrest them. If they arrested Adams and Hancock, put them in jail, then, maybe the other, patriots wouldn't be quite so brave. So Adams and Hancock were hiding in Lexington. The British soldiers left Boston at midnight. Now, we don't think anything of it because we have electric streetlights, we have lanterns and cars. I mean, it's really easy for us to move around at midnight. But in 1775, there were no flashlights. They they would have to travel along the road in the complete darkness. So when the British left Boston at midnight, they were basically the special forces of the day. Because at that point in time, when the sun goes down, everybody stops shooting, and you wait until morning to, resume the conflict. But if the soldiers are marching, starting out at midnight and continuing through the early morning, there's got to be something special going on. And their purpose was to march to Lexington, about 15 miles away, and their plan was to arrest John Hancock and Samuel Adams, basically catch them off guard, because nobody would expect the British there at 7 o'clock in the morning. But Paul Revere and several other people riding on horseback went to sound the alarm. They alerted Hancock and Adams ahead of time, who left Lexington about 2 hours before the soldiers arrived. And when the British arrived, there was a significant group of people there with their muskets who refused to walk away. And if Adams and Hancock had been arrested, our American history would clearly have been very different.
Now, it's interesting to note that the American Revolution or Rebellion, if you will, actually began a year before the Declaration of Independence was written. Tell us about that.
Well, the British arrived in in Lexington on the morning of April 19th, 1775. And, the British soldiers were pretty much used to people doing exactly what they said, because they were kind of in charge. And so the British showed up. They were faced with a small mob with muskets, and they said, lay down your arms and disperse. It's like, go home. And the Patriots didn't do that. They didn't, fight back. They just stood there and they just refused to follow orders. And so the British were really kind of, surprised that, people weren't running and, headed home. And anybody who's been to Lexington, you take the tour, they tell you that we really don't know who fired the first shot. It may have been somebody that just kind of tripped a little bit, accidentally pulled the trigger, made some noise, and both sides, thought that they were being attacked, and both sides responded in kind of self-defense. Well, the Patriots chased the British all the way back to Boston and proceeded in killing about half of them before the British could return to Boston.
It's also interesting when you actually look into the history and discover what it actually was rather than what you actually learned in school. And, a couple of times we've brought up, for instance, arms, being able to have weapons. And, obviously we've got a huge ongoing gun debate about, what our rights are to have and bear arms. And going back to the citizenship about, a citizen of the United States, that if you go back to we the people, that we have that right, according to the Constitution, the Second Amendment, to have and bear arms, but yet for some strange reason they're wanting us to, get gun permits, things like that. In other words, ask permission to have these things because accordingly we're citizens of the United States. How do you get around something like that?
Well, I just try to use logic. And I draw people to their own contradiction. They start to talk about the Second Amendment. I go, well, let's back up. There's a First Amendment. And, the First Amendment, one of the things that it does is to guarantee your freedom of religion. And I ask, have you ever filled out a government form that allows you to exercise your religion? And again, people look at me like I'm from Mars. It's like, what is Michael talking about? I said, you've never gotten permission from the government to exercise your religion and believe in God? And I go, no, that's ridiculous. The government cannot demand a permit or a license for the exercise of a right. So I said, you can think about God even without government permission. They go, well, yeah, it's freedom of religion. It's a right. Well, wonderful. Applause. I agree with you wholeheartedly. Now please explain how the Second Amendment is different than the First Amendment. They were both ratified in 1791. Do I have a right to life? Do I have a right to defend my life? And if I have a right to defend my life, why am I not allowed to decide the best way to defend my life? And the answer is, if you don't need a church permit, then I sure as heck don't need a concealed carry permit. I mean, they work the same way. And anybody who thinks they have freedom of speech, but not the freedom to keep and bear arms, they're lying to themselves. This is cognitive dissonance. It cannot work both ways.
And again, I was thinking about this as I was reading in your book about different things that we do. For instance, those who purchase a car, okay? All of a sudden now we're bound by having to have a driver's license. Well, this is your personal property. You should be able to jump in your car and drive it without having any of that nonsense. But once you have those permits, you've just surrendered your rights, and now you're bound by the laws that surround that particular license. And you kind of wonder yourself, what happens when you get pulled over by an officer and you're citing the Constitution that, no, I don't have to have a driver's license, and no, I don't have to have insurance. I'm entitled to use my property any way I choose to, as long as it doesn't harm or infringe on the freedom of somebody else.
Well, it's really kind of interesting. I've been pulled over several times. I do not use a driver's license, much to the dismay of my friends. But the police officer said, "Can I see your driver's license?" "No, you may not." "Well, why not?" "Well, because I don't have one." "And why not?" "Well, it's because I'm not required to have one." And I show them in Title 18 of the United States Code, Section 31, where the definition of vehicle is any contrivance used to convey goods or passengers for hire. And then I hand them a list of court decisions, many of which were Supreme Court decisions, that explicitly say that you do not require a permit in order to exercise your right to travel. The right to travel is so old, it was recognized in the Articles of Confederation, which precedes the Constitution. So, the Supreme Court has recognized that you have a right to travel. But anybody who thinks that the driver's license is there for safety, it's like, if you have a driver's license, at least you know how to operate a vehicle. How many accidents, automobile accidents, do we have every day in the United States? I heard a number one time about, 4,500. I have no idea if that's accurate. But if we have 4,500 automobile accidents a day, you multiply that by 365, and that's a lot of automobile accidents. And almost every one of those people have a driver's license. So how can the driver's license ensure that somebody knows how to drive when so many people with a driver's license are getting into accidents? It's obviously not true. The whole license, the registration scheme, the license plate, all of that is for revenue. The states and the counties are making lots and lots of money off of their parking tickets and speeding tickets and, turning, at the corner without using your turn signal. And most of us are so busy going to work, it's like, oh, man, well, what's easier? Taking a day or two off of work, going to court, and trying to fight it when you know that you're probably going to lose anyway, or just writing a check. It's $125, but I can write the check, I can mail it in, the whole thing goes away, and I can go back to my original lifestyle. Well, the whole system is designed. The system is designed to make it difficult or impossible to fight the system and very, very easy to pay the fine. So it's all about revenue.
Yeah, and it's gotten even worse these days because now you get the fine and they add up what they call plus, extras. So in other words, you'll have a fine, let's say it's $45. By the time you're done paying it, you paid out $160. I'm thinking, well,
Yeah.
now aren't we bordering on extortion in some way?
Well, no, we're not bordering on extortion. This is extortion. This is extortion, plain and simple. Pay the fine or we put you in jail. It's the moral equivalent of the mafia coming into your restaurant and saying, you owe us, X number of dollars every month for protection. Otherwise, we are going to burn down your restaurant. You're paying protection from the people who are threatening you with danger. So that's not protection, that's extortion, and that's exactly what almost every level of government does.
Well, here's the interesting thing, and I was just discovering this. We have that big Broadway hit musical Hamilton that everybody's familiar with. What I found interesting is what you wrote in your book, Good to Be King, is that Alexander Hamilton actually wanted the same kind of, I guess, governing force as was in England, which was the place we were trying to get away from and do our own thing. That's pretty interesting.
Alexander Hamilton was a monarchist. He did not particularly care for King George, but he thought that King George Washington would be a good idea. And anecdotally, I have no historic evidence to back it up, but several places I've found that Alexander Hamilton asked George Washington if he would like to be the president or the king of the United States. I don't know if the question was ever asked, but if it was, fortunately for us, George Washington said no. Alexander Hamilton actually did say that the people are too stupid to make their own decisions, that they need smart people like Alexander Hamilton to make their decisions for them. Well, that is like the epitome of arrogance. I probably would have, shot and killed Alexander Hamilton myself if Aaron Burr hadn't done it for us. But when we operated under the Articles of Confederation, we had a loosely organized government. We had a federal government. That's why we call them the Articles of Confederation. And the 13 colonies were united in something equivalent to the United Nations. They were still free, sovereign, and independent countries or states, but they were joining forces to defend each other. When the economy didn't work, a delegation was sent to Philadelphia to tweak the Articles of Confederation, add a sentence, delete a paragraph, and basically make some changes that would stimulate the economy again. Alexander Hamilton and his boys showed up a week early. They presented a rough draft known as the Virginia Plan and basically sabotaged the Articles of Confederation, creating what was a much stronger central government. And the reason that Alexander Hamilton wanted a strong central government is so that he could help be in charge of it. And so Alexander Hamilton was realistically a nationalist. He wanted to create one strong country. But he knew that people in the colonies would not support that. So Alexander Hamilton lied, and he called his group of people Federalists, implying they were only seeking a loosely organized government. Thomas Jefferson was actually a Federalist. That was what he wanted. It was an agrarian society where people, grow in their farms and all the power is distributed as loosely as possible. So Jefferson really was a Federalist, but Alexander Hamilton basically said, well, we are Federalists, you're the opposite of us, so you must be anti-Federalists. And so basically Hamilton switched the names on the door, and before the Constitution was even ratified, our politicians were already lying to it.
I know as the listeners are sitting here and they're hearing this, they wonder, okay, so how do I regain my sovereignty according to the Constitution that I'm entitled to? What do you do?
Well, it is not an easy process, to be sure. There is no piece of paper that I can give you to sign, and you mail it in, certified return receipt, and the government goes, "Oh my gosh, John figured it out." And
Especially if you check the box that says I am a citizen of the United States.
Yeah. Well, you have for so many years been misled into thinking that you're a citizen of the United States. That you have. You've got a driver's license, a Social Security card. All these documents are prima facie evidence that you have volunteered to be a citizen of the United States. And it's going to be difficult to overcome that perception in court. But, if you're a slave on a plantation and you go, well, wait a minute, I don't have to live here, I can leave the plantation, you really should not be surprised when, the plantation owner tries to track you down and, put you in chains and bring you back. Because, they want to keep you in slavery. They want to keep you, doing the things that are beneficial to them. So there's a number of things that you can do. None of them are guaranteed to work. But, the first thing you want to do is announce to the world that you are not a slave, and you can create an affidavit of sovereignty. Say, look, I don't want to be a United States citizen. I don't want to be subject to Congress under the 14th Amendment. And you can sign it, notarize it, and have it documented at your local county courthouse. I've done that in the past. So many people have started doing that now the county clerks are going, no, we can't file that for you. Well, it's not true. I have mine filed, and I was really surprised when I took mine to the county clerk. She was very friendly, said, I don't know where to put this. I'm going to have to do some research. Well, she came back 20 minutes later and said, oh, now I know. And we filed my affidavit of sovereignty under real property, which means that I own my body. My body is real property, and I am taking ownership of my body. And it's amazing to us in the United States to think that it would require paperwork to announce that. I mean, don't we all take that for granted? And the answer is no. No, the government does not take for granted that you own your own body. The government takes for granted that you are a United States citizen, that you have volunteered to have a driver's license, a concealed carry permit, and to pay your income taxes every April 15th.
So how has the end result been for you with all of this then?
It is very difficult. I'm not going to pretend to anybody that I have the ultimate answer. I mean, if I did, that is the class that I would be teaching. I would have all the paperwork, computerized, and I would just, type in your name, fill in the blanks, and I would charge you $5,000 for the paperwork that you just had to sign, but there's no guarantee. The people in government are not stupid. They are not careless. They are not just oblivious to our rights. The people in government are evil. They know exactly what they're doing, and they are doing it deliberately to keep you in the dark, to keep you in your mode of voluntary servitude. They said, we're not keeping you in slavery. You volunteered to do this. You go, oh, I did? I didn't know that I did. But the whole process, once you start to look at the government and how they operate, there is a legal term called mens rea, which is guilty mind. If a 6-year-old breaks a lamp, well, okay, that's an accident. Maybe you shouldn't have been throwing the football in the living room. But, breaking the lamp was an accident. Well, when you take the lamp and hide the lamp in the closet, That's an indication that you knew what you were doing. You knew it was wrong, and you're trying to hide the evidence of your accident. And it's not so much breaking the lamp that's a crime, it's the lying about it, the trying to cover it up that is the essence of your guilt. And, most people do not lie. They don't, try to use fraud. They are good, and they really are good American people. And it's difficult for them to imagine that somebody else would do that, much less somebody in our government. And it's like when we talk about the Holocaust and we find out how many people were just, efficiently eliminated during the Holocaust, we are in shock. We're in horror. It's like, how could that happen? How could anybody imagine that that was a legitimate thing to do? Because it is so far outside of our scope of reality that we can't even comprehend, a person thinking like that. Well, similarly, most of us tell the truth. Most of us do not use fraud. Most of us are honest in our business transactions. And so when the government does something that inconveniences us, we are prone to give them the benefit of the doubt. That's like, well, okay, they didn't realize what they were doing. It's like being at a party. Somebody steps on your foot. The first thing that you think is that it was an accident. I mean, they didn't want to step on my foot. They were just not paying attention. They accidentally stepped on my foot. How many times in a row do they have to step on your foot before you start to wonder, well, maybe this wasn't an accident? Maybe this was a deliberate attempt to hurt me. And you have to study the government a little while before you finally realize that this is all an attempt to deliberately keep us in involuntary servitude.
Well, we certainly hear a lot of that this day and age where people seem to be awakening to it, but then it's taking that next step to be able to bring things back into our own personal control. And I understand that there's a possibility that Texas is looking to cede from the United States. Is that true?
It is true and has been true for quite some time. I arrived in Texas in '97, and I was here less than a month, and people were talking about it, not aggressively. They kind of whisper, but, the idea was if they had a chance to vote for secession, they would. There was no strong belief that it was going to happen right away, but the desire was there. Well, since '97, which is almost, 20 years now, that feeling has increased. There is an organization called the Texas Nationalist Movement. The website is thetnm.org. And we already have 250,000 people, more than 250,000 people, who are actively calling for Texas to leave the Union. Now, the word secession has a pejorative tone to it. And it depends on what side of the argument you're on. The Declaration of Independence that we will be celebrating on Monday is a secession document. We used to be under the British Crown. The Declaration of Independence explicitly says that we are and of right ought to be free, sovereign, and independent states, and that all allegiance to the British Crown is hereby terminated. Okay? We are no longer a part of England. We're going to start our own country. Well, from our point of view, we were really happy about that. We were talking about our independence. Well, King George and people in England were not quite so happy because they were losing all of the resources, and they were not happy that the 13 colonies decided to secede. So if you talk about Texas secession, people go, "Whoa, those evil Texans, they're guilty of treason. They're trying to leave the United States." But if you're in Texas and you're going, we've got this terrible economy. The federal government is, hurting us more than helping us, and we want our independence back. Well, when you talk about Texas independence, there is no pejorative meaning to that. Independence is always a good thing. And so when we talk about Texas being its own country again, it helps a lot if we talk about Texas independence, because people are in favor of independence, rather than talking about Texas secession, which people don't understand why, but they have a bad feeling about secession.
I'm sure that when people take your class, they must come away feeling empowered, but I'm sure that they also find themselves in somewhat of a conundrum wondering, well, what do I do next?
They do. It is helpful to know that you're not the only one out there feeling the same way. And, there's a lot of networking that goes on. And my class is called An Introduction to the Constitution. Because once you take my class, you go, well, gosh, what else is it, that I don't know? And, my students are often sent on a lifelong journey of enlightenment where they start to read Thomas Jefferson, they start to read Benjamin Franklin and John Locke, and it's like, oh my gosh, look at what these guys said. Well, yeah, once you understand the basic principles, you understand why they declared their independence, why they were willing to stand up against the most powerful army and navy in the world in order to assert their independence. Nobody is going to tell me what to do. I am sovereign, and, it is just a feeling, and it is empowering and invigorating, and it's like, okay, you're not going to try to leave the plantation if you didn't know that you were a slave. But if you realize that the plantation owner has got it really good, they're eating really good food while you're, struggling in the fields, it's like, well, that's not fair. And, you suddenly realize that you have been taken advantage of. You've been betrayed. And that sense of betrayal is very difficult to accept. I mean, I've had students in my class literally crying at the end of the day as they learn just how corrupt and evil their government is. I mean, they used to love the United States and all the things we were taught in school, and they find out that's not the way life really is. And it's like, oh my gosh, it is. It is definitely a shock.
I'll bet they're looking at this political process for the people who are running for president. They scratch their head and go, why don't we just vote for none of the above?
Well, interestingly enough, that's always a choice if you're looking at a libertarian ballot. Libertarians have conventions. We get together and select our favorite people. But we recognize that out of the group that you're looking at, nobody may be acceptable. I don't like any one of them. And so it is part of our libertarian platform that you always get to vote for none of the above. And I have been personal witness to a half a dozen votes where somebody thought they had the nomination all wrapped up, and surprise, libertarians really do use it. We would rather not have anybody on the ballot than to have somebody who does not accurately represent our philosophy and our point of view.
Now, what I find really intriguing when we come to talk about this, or you see or hear people talking about this, about the government, is that we need to get our democracy back. And in your book, you actually outline, well, is democracy really a good thing? And I'll give you an idea. I think this is really kind of interesting here. In 2003, there was a case that was Lawrence versus Texas. I thought that would be an interesting one to bring up when you consider, Is democracy a good thing? Tell us about that one.
Well, I'm not familiar with that particular case, but I do know that the Founding Fathers loathed a democracy. You can categorize government based on where the power is. The first type of government is a monarchy where one person is in charge. But if you don't trust the king or the emperor, you can create a subcommittee, which is called an oligarchy. That's where a small number of people make the rules, and everybody else is obligated to follow the rules. Well, that's kind of what we have with Congress. They make all sorts of rules. Oddly enough, they consider themselves exempt from many of the rules that they write. And so then you can go say, well, okay, if we're going to let everybody vote. That democracy is a Greek word for rule by the many. Well, the problem is that in a democracy, 51% can vote away the rights or property of the other 49%. You know, in a democracy, you only have the rights or the privileges that the benevolent, majority allows you to have. And as soon as you have a democracy, you automatically split the population into men versus women, gay versus straight, Republican versus Democrat. Whatever your choices are, there's always another group, and it forces us to vote against each other because I want my team to be in the majority. I want my team to win. Well, this is not the Super Bowl. We're supposed to be in this together. And the difference is that in a republic, there are certain things you're just not allowed to vote on. You're not allowed to vote on my rights. You're not allowed to vote on my property. You're not allowed to vote on the color of my living room. It's like, oh, I like red. I think we're going to come over and paint your living room red. Like, why? Well, we took a vote. Well, who's we? Who are all these people voting on the color of my living room? It's my living room. I'm the one who's going to live here. And nobody else has any justification for voting on what color my living room is. And so it's hazardous because we fall into a trap. If you listen to the news, they're always talking about democracy this, democracy that, and it's a sabotage because the United States is not a democracy. I pledge allegiance to the flag and to the republic for which it stands. So, again, even the simplest ideas are misunderstood by very much of our population.
Well, I thought what I was bringing up here in Lawrence versus Texas was pretty relevant when you consider that we are now legalizing gay marriage in states. And in Lawrence versus Texas, the Supreme Court struck down an anti-sodomy law that was in Texas. And it was pretty interesting because this is a situation where you realize here's a subset of people that may not like homosexuals, so they feel that they're going to go through government and have laws passed that say these people don't have the right to live the way they prefer to. And you can see how democracy in action right there doesn't even make any sense. Okay, maybe you as let's say a Christian, don't believe homosexuality should exist or even be allowed to be practiced, whatever the case may be. So you think that you're entitled to have the government pass a law so these guys become the bad guys, and you're not even involved in this lifestyle, and it's pretty bad when you get a subset of a population that's trying to legally enforce their interpretation of morality.
It is very much, and I just checked it out on the internet, and this is a perfect example of democracy, where a small percentage of the population uses the government as their billy club to subject their own personal ideas on another subset of the population. And, what is difficult for me is to imagine a situation where people could literally think that slavery or segregation was okay. Now, the Constitution says Congress is not allowed to eliminate slavery until after 1809. So it was 1810, 1811, 1812. When did we eliminate slavery? Well, finally, in 1865, we came up with the 13th Amendment and said no slavery or involuntary servitude. It leaves the door open for voluntary servitude, which all of our United States citizens have fallen into. But in 1965, this is 100 years after the 13th Amendment was, ratified. In 1965, I was on vacation with my parents. We were somewhere in the southeast. I don't remember what state it was in. And we walked into the gas station, and the gas station had a sign over the drinking fountain that said "Whites Only." Now, I was a Boy Scout. I used to carry the flag in every parade every year, and I was asking my mom, I was like, what does that mean? What do you mean, whites only? And when she told me, I was horrified. I was absolutely horrified. Here I am, carrying the American flag, thinking that the United States is the greatest country in the world, and you're telling me that you can't take a drink of water because your color of your skin? It's just preposterous. And I was only 10 years old. But that type of bigotry, it doesn't exist to the same extent that it used to. As it turns out, I saw a statistic that said 1 out of every 7 relationships in the United States is interracial. Not specifically black and white, but you pick the combination, and the children are happy and beautiful, and it's like, so what's your problem? I mean, why would you even care? And it's just difficult to imagine, at least to me, how people could be so closed-minded to try to control other people's lives. You don't want anybody controlling your life. You don't want anybody telling you who you can or cannot, have a relationship with. So then why are you trying to tell somebody else? It is completely preposterous to me, and there's no logical justification for it in my head.
Well, it's certainly mind-numbing, makes you want to pull your hair out just realizing that it continues on, and you think to yourself, how obtuse can people actually be? I don't know. I think that's a question that's almost infinite sometimes.
It is. It makes, philosophers ponder for a long time. But it is up to us. It is up to us to make the changes in our own lives and in the lives of the people around us so that we can enjoy liberty. I mean, the hardest part about liberty is allowing someone else to exercise their liberty. I was walking down the sidewalk one time with a buddy of mine, and somebody with a purple mohawk and a leather jacket, and they had piercings in their nose and their ears. I think they literally had a chain going from the tip of their nose to their earlobe or something unusual. And, we walked by, and after the person was, behind us and out of earshot, my friend says, "Did you see that?" And I said, they have rights too. I mean, you may not be interested in inviting this person to your birthday party, but just because they are different than you doesn't mean that they don't have that right. If they're not hurting you, if they're not, taking your property, then just let them alone. This person, you might be surprised how similar your political views are, but if you are so surprised and revulsed by the purple hair that they're wearing, you may never know what a great friend you could have had.
And that's so important too to realize, like with this, ongoing thing, with the gay marriage and things like that. And I think to myself, look, if a person's out there pursuing their happiness, okay, and they're not infringing on anybody else's happiness, let them do what they're doing. Leave them alone. Don't sit there
Leave
with
them alone. Yeah. And the good news is that homosexuality isn't contagious. I mean, you can hug these people and you're not going to change your sexual preference. The same thing is true with Democrats and Republicans. I've hugged Democrats and Republicans and I didn't change my political stance. So, you're entitled to think what you want. All we're asking is that you recognize other people's right to think what they want. Mm-hmm. As long as they're not hurting you, as long as they're not taking, your property, then, it really shouldn't be a problem. And so, again, I highly recommend that we stop fighting each other. It's not the guy with the purple mohawk that's taking 25% of your paycheck. It's the government. It's the government that is pitting us against each other. And, instead of fighting each other, we would be making a lot more progress if we, smarten up and we start fighting against the government that is guilty of treason. They are taking our property, they're violating our rights, and we allow it to happen because, most of us are afraid to confront them. We don't want the conflict. And for the most part, we're not even sure how to proceed. Well, first of all, you have to understand your rights, which is what my Constitution class helps you to do. Once you understand your rights and you realize just how far from the Constitution our government has strayed, then it's going to be difficult for you to sleep at night if you're not doing something. You've got to be doing something to fix the problem.
Well, I totally agree with you, and that's certainly what celebrating independence is all about, is being able to have that independence, but realize that, it takes work and it takes responsibility to have that. And, this book, Good to Be King, I encourage the listeners out there, get this. It's, one of those you pick up, you read, you'll put it aside, then you'll pick it up again and realize, God, I missed that last time, and boy, and it really leaves you kind of shaking your head like, how do I get out of a mess like this?
It's difficult. It's going to take some time. It's going to take some bravery in our pipe, but we are Americans. We threw off the shackles of King George. We can also throw off the shackles of the IRS, the ATF, Department of Education, and there are lots of people out there who share the same concerns that you do, but you're going to have to turn off the TV, get out of the house to find those people if you're planning to work with them to improve the life that we would like to have here in the United States.
Now, Michael, where can people find Good to Be King?
About the only place you can find it is on my website. It's constitutionpreservation.org. You can find copies on Amazon.com, but because there is an impression that the book is out of print, you can spend, hundreds of dollars for a copy of my book. I wish I could charge $100 for a copy of the book. But you can get my book for $25 in shipping by visiting constitutionpreservation.org. If you have any questions, feel free to call me. I'm here to restore liberty. And if you are willing to be one of the freedom fighters out on the front lines, arguing against, communism and this whole collectivist idea, then the least I can do is to help you establish the intellectual ammunition that you need to win the argument.
Well, it certainly sounds like you'll truly be enjoying the 4th of July celebration. And I want to thank you, Michael, again for joining us back here on the program. It's always an eye-opener to have you on as a guest.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I wish all of your listeners a very happy Independence Day. You know, the fact that it falls on the 4th of July is just merely a coincidence.
Well, Michael, again, thank you so much for joining us here on the program today.
Okay, thanks so much.
Again, the book is Good to Be King. Our guest, Michael Badnarik, joining us here on the Beyond 50 radio program. You can also discover more by visiting us at beyond50radio.com. That is the number 50. We encourage you to sign up for our weekly e-news updates so you can find out what's going on in the Beyond 50 community and upcoming shows as well. Follow us on Twitter at Beyond 50 Radio as well as Facebook. I'm Daniel Davis. Thank you for tuning in. This is the Beyond 50 radio program, and remember, live your day past halfway.